The Chicano movement. El movimiento, the movement in which Mexican Americans defined and took pride in their own identity, asserted their civil rights, and worked towards self-determination by improving their financial, social, and political circumstances, also known as El Movimiento. And the dates were 1960s and 70s. The location, northwestern, southwestern, and parts of the midwestern United States. There were several different areas that the Chicano movement touched, such as farm worker rights, political, educational, and overall pride and empowerment. Farm worker rights. Farm worker rights protested the exploitation of Mexican-American migrant farm workers who traveled throughout the United States following crop seasons for wages that kept their families well below the poverty level. Because migrant families were unable to stay in town for much time, workers' children were limited to 2 to 3 years of education before they would pick for growers. Both adults and children were exposed to poisonous pesticides and the harsh sun for long periods of time, and other detrimental conditions. To put an end to these conditions, Mexican-American migrant workers organized. Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez co-founded the National Farm Workers Association in 1962, which later evolved into the United Farm Workers. They initiated strikes, boycotted various fruits and vegetables in support of farm worker rights. Cesar Chavez. Born Cesario Estrada Chavez on March 31, 1927 in Yuma, Arizona. As a young boy, Chavez and his family were migrant workers. Cesar Chavez was a union leader and labor organizer that dedicated his life to improving the treatment and pay and working conditions of farm workers. As a labor leader, Chavez employed nonviolent means to bring attention to the plight of farm workers. He led marches, called for boycotts, and went on several hunger strikes. He also brought national awareness to the dangers of pesticides to workers' health. He died on April 23rd in 1993 in San Luis, Arizona. East LA walkouts. 200 students from Roosevelt High School and 800 students from Lincoln High School walked out of their classes in protest on Wednesday, March 6, 1968. They called themselves the Brown Berets. The boycott began on Tuesday, March 5th with Garfield and Jefferson high schools. At first, students said that they were protesting bad cafeteria food, but when they got a chance to speak up about the issue, they said that they were protesting an effort to gain bilingual instruction, teaching of Mexican culture, heritage in schools, and Mexican-oriented cafeteria food. Sal Castro was one of the teachers at Lincoln High School who is said to have encouraged the walkouts. He and 12 others were arrested on charges of initiating walkouts, but they were later released. He showed up to school in the fall to teach, and he was told he no longer had a job. When students found out there was another protest, they staged a sit at one of the student board offices. One of their demands was for Castro to be given his job back. This went on for over a week, with students refusing to leave the building. 35 arrested for trespassing. In the end, Castro did get his job back. Things didn't change immediately, but they had found their voice and their place in the civil rights movement. 18 months after the walkouts, Chicanos began enrolling in colleges for the first time. This was a huge victory for them. Their parents had never entertained such an idea as getting a higher education. Important court cases of the Chicano movement. As the fight for equality in schools began in the 1960s, Chicano activism actually happened well before then. In the 1940s and 50s, Hispanics won 2 major legal victories. The first, Mendez versus Westminster. It was a 1947 case that stopped the segregating of Latino schoolchildren from white children. It proved to be an important predecessor to Brown versus the Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court determined that the separate but equal policy in schools violated the Constitution. The second, Hernandez versus Texas. In 1954, Hernandez versus Texas was a case that the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection to all racial groups, not just blacks and whites. Protests in Mexico. A protest against the Vietnam War and demands for greater democracy and economic justice jumped over borders and challenged authorities in many countries around the world, including France, Germany, Italy, Czechoslovakia, Argentina, Japan, and the United States. In Europe, the first protest took place in Berlin. In April, the protests began after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In May, the protests to paralyze France. In July, Mexican police attacked marchers carrying posters when thousands rallied against violence. Police fired into the crowds. In August and September, activists protested the Olympic Games, claiming the money spent on the Games should have been used to alleviate countries with widespread poverty. Aztlan. The concept of Aztlan as a place of origin of the pre-Columbian Mexican civilization has become a symbol for various Mexican nationalist and indigenous movements. The name Aztlan was first taken up by a group of Chicano independent activists led by Oscar Zeta Acosta during the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. They used the name Aztlan to refer to the lands of northern Mexico that were annexed by the United States as the result of the Mexican-American War. These activists identified the failures of the United States government to live up to the promises it had made in the Treaty of the Guadalupe Hidalgo. According to the activists, Mexican Americans were a conquered people who needed to reclaim their birthright and cultural heritage as part of a new nation, which later became known as Aztlan. Chicano. The term Chicano was originally used as a derogatory label for the children of Mexican migrants. People on both sides of the border considered this new generation of Mexican Americans as neither American nor Mexican. In the 1960s, the term Chicano came to be accepted as a symbol of self-determination and ethnic pride. Works cited. Picture citations.